And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 2023 daily briefing from COP28 over in Dubai. Boy, it looks like it's going to be a fun roller coaster so far. As many of you probably are watching in the news, there's a lot of controversial stuff coming out of Dubai. In fact, I think we started this year learning when that Dubai was going to be the location, and all the mixed feelings about holding it in the oil capital of the world. John, live boots on the ground. How does it feel for 2023 holding a COP in the oil capital of the world?
Well, I suppose, last year we were in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is just the other side of Saudi Arabia from here. So we took a leapfrog Saudi Arabia from Sharm el-Sheikh to Dubai. It's a very interesting place. It's shiny. I would describe it as very shiny new. It has a large population. The city has about 2.5 million people. And the first couple of nights, we stayed very near the airport, sort of the downtown area. And that area is populated mainly by guest workers. Everyone around us was Indian, Nepalese, African, variety of people, all very nice and cordial and pleasant. English is the primary language in that section of town. And a nice stay and lights and people on the street at night. To have a little repair done on a cell phone and dropped it off in the afternoon. They told me to come pick it up at 10:30, and their store was still going strong. So it has a commercial nightlife, I'm sure, due to the heat, and people shift their working schedule more towards the nighttime hours. It's a very nice metro system. We took the metro from downtown, another 45 minutes over toward an area called the Marina. There are many tall towers. We wound up with an apartment on the 26th floor of one of those towers next to the water. And you'll see that in the backdrop of a future episode later in the week. And that's sort of the upscale residential, or one of the many scale residential and tourist areas of Dubai. So big tourist industry here, supported by guest workers, and then of course the oil industry. As you're flying into Dubai from the Qatar direction, you see out in the Gulf. Dubai sits right at the Straits of Hormuz. So in Florida, Key West is a short hop over to Cuba. That's kind of the same thing from Dubai over to Iran. And that's a very narrow strait through which many of the oil tankers pass. So it's often a focal point of conflict. But flying in at night, you see all the lights in the water. And those are all the oil and gas platforms working away. The central hub, and then many, 7 to 10 of these surrounding it in a large arc. So you definitely know you're in oil country if you're flying into Dubai. People have been very nice so far, or to be equally nice and engage in conversation. Met some interesting people. But we just settled into the hotel we were staying last night. So everything is still a little bit up in the air. And Dana, who will be joining us, she doesn't arrive until tomorrow evening. And she'll be co-hosting this with us. And she is a member of what's called Democrats Abroad. She explains to me that Democrats Abroad has a comparable status as with the Florida Democratic Party or any state Democratic Party around the country. And she's based out of Finland, so she's coming in and will be joining us tomorrow or day after tomorrow.
That's absolutely wonderful. So we're going to have quite a few interesting guests that will be hosting over the next couple of weeks. And we're going to also see a lot of pictures, a lot of video footage on the ground, what's happening in Dubai. It's, as John mentioned, it's a flashy city, isn't it? Uh, very flashy city. I've already seen a few pictures of what it looks like from some of the high rises over there. A lot of energy goes into making Dubai look as pretty as it does. However, we have perhaps a few controversial pieces of news starting on day one. We'll start with the good, I suppose. Apparently, the Victory Fund, or COP28, essentially kicked off with an agreement for the Victory Fund. Victory Fund was a proposal to continue to help developing nations achieve some of their visions and strategies for becoming or industrializing at a carbon neutral pace. Whether or not that actually accomplishes anything other than sequestering, funds into political pockets, we don't really know. But it seems like there is some sort of groundbreaking announcements starting on day one, which is really important, I think, to get this to salvage this disaster, which a lot of people have suggested that it is, including the fact that some very high political people have decided not to attend this event. Russia is noticeably absent. Canada has refused to send a few of their ministers, high-profile ministers. The Pope recently, who had said that he was going to COP28, has instead declined as of a few hours ago. So it seems like it may be an issue that some of these high-profile leaders are not attending the event. However, with this Victory Fund being established, John, what are your thoughts on a concept like the Victory Fund? Developing nations getting access to some of these funds and potentially using them in an incorrect way.
Well, it's very interesting you mentioned that. The fellow who was representing the owner of the apartment that we rented, he was assisting a woman who was, I think, an official realtor. And we started a little conversation. He's from Nigeria. I taught in Cameroon next door many years ago. And turns out that he's something of an entrepreneur. And he has ideas for solving some of the waste problems in his country. He says the old tires are just everywhere and desperate need of disposal or recycling. So he's exploring different opportunities there. And then he's also interested in solar technology. So we had a little, we took care of the realty paperwork and we launched into some very interesting conversations about all the things that he's interested in and my background in engineering and some of my experience that would apply to his interests. So there are people out there with a lot of energy, a lot of young people who can take these things on, take on these projects. But it's very important that these funds be managed properly so that they get to the right people with the energy and the determination to actually deliver productivity from that investment. So it's a necessary concept. We have to take advantage of the energies, talent, the knowledge, the learning ability of young people everywhere in the world, which is why I selected this higher education pavilion for the first evening. So of course, we need to do more of that. We need to do more of it in our own country. We need to direct additional funds to young people so that they can get a start into these innovative industries. And you sort of were involved in that back in 2020 during your campaign.
Yeah, that's very true. The campaign that myself and a bunch of other young people ran in the state of Florida was all about higher education being taken into politics, not the other way around, which I know a lot of people would frankly disagree with. However, I thoroughly enjoyed that experience, mostly because the concept is brilliant. More science needs to be brought into politics, not the other way around. And that just seems to be something that we thoroughly don't misunderstand in Florida. Not only due to our governor, who's taken the positions that he has, but also our board of governors who oversee the university system across the state of Florida. Frankly, both as a student and as someone who has run for political office in the past, I find that frankly ridiculous that a lot of the board of governor decisions are political decisions at heart, not involving the science directly as it should. And in fact, the entire reason that I'm here today, even in this capacity, is simply to enhance the role of science into our political deliberations and discussions, and to also engage in meaningful dialogue to move the conversation forward from conversation to action. And that's something that both I find as a student to be very meaningful, but also as a member of the Democratic Party to be frankly very, very engaging, very enlightening too.
It's this year's COP. I was looking over the list of pavilions. Several universities have full pavilions this year, and you will recall from prior COPs that they would have the little kiosk stands. The universities were relegated to that 1 week representation, 2 chairs and a screen. But now they have full pavilions, and this is a shared pavilion from what looks like about a dozen or more universities. So I'll definitely stop by here and listen to some of the presentations. Be curious to see if University of Florida actually has any speakers in this pavilion. The locations of the pavilions in this exposition complex is uncertain. They provided a wonderful map this year, broken down into areas and buildings. But my spot checking, I tried to track down about 5 pavilions. None were in the locations that the map said they should be. I really have no idea how we're going to navigate this, because things are scattered. It's a different layout. In the past, there have been maybe 4 or 5 large exposition halls into which all of the pavilions, all of the 180, 190 pavilions would fit. Here, there are 80 buildings. And I think at least 50 of them are used by this conference. So each building has sometimes 1 pavilion in it, sometimes 8 pavilions, but nothing like the consolidated traffic and touring experience that you get in the larger exhibition hall. So they tried to adapt the top concept to this particular venue, and we're going to see how it works out. It's very pretty. The weather's nice. It's virtually identical weather to what I left in Florida. So we'll have to see how we navigate and find our way around this pavilion. Now, you'd mentioned that Russia was not here. They are actually listed as having a pavilion this year, as is Ukraine, as is Israel, as is Palestine. A lot of nations you think might not appear at this event, but they're here, at least on paper. Finding them is another matter, however. And a lot of the pavilions are still setting up, so we'll see where they finally settle on as far as which buildings and which areas.
I suppose the next segment that I'd like to get into is twofold. One is perhaps your sense that the ground rails are coming off, so to speak, where the map simply is not showing the correct location. And there's other, I assume other signs that maybe the conference isn't getting off to the start that you might see it as on the ground, but also the fact that a lot of news stories, especially last week, that kind of leaked showed that that UAE was seriously attempting to use COP28 as a means to propel the use of fossil fuels as long as possible, to extend their timeline as long as possible. Do you get the sense that either of those two things are true? That the COP28 pavilions are showing any signs of a difference over the last few years in terms of quality, but also two, that the UAE administration is on the ground attempting to promote the use of fossil fuels or extend and lengthen its timeline?
Well, I guess this is kind of a company town, so to speak. It's an oil industry nation, an oil industry city, and therefore the people here are going to be preoccupied with that primary pursuit. Oil producers versus oil consumers. I mean, one can point the finger at the other. So not so sure that that's entirely relevant. In Texas and any other oil producing part of the United States, they're going to be looking to sell their oil for as long as they possibly can as well. I suppose the question becomes with fossil fuels is the economics. The only way we're going to reduce the use of fossil fuels, or perhaps allocate a portion of the fossil fuels to the sequestration process, because to capture the CO2, basically a chemical reaction, an industrial process, a biological process, and it requires energy input. That energy can come from solar sources, when you're growing plants and capturing carbon that way, or it can be from fossil fuels. So you pump it out of the ground, maybe a fraction of those fossil fuels are used to drive the industrial process that captures the CO2 and sequesters it. So that's clearly the direction they're looking at. But the feasibility of it is one from the industrial side, the basic chemistry and the industrial processes that are required to achieve it, and then the economics. So we have to look at how the economics are going to either make that possible or make it just a pipe dream, and in effect a form of greenwashing, where they talk about it but they don't really do much of it. So to get where we need to be, we have to determine what fraction of fossil fuel extractions would have to go into the carbon sequestration. And given that removal of, say, 20, 30% of their profits, or whatever the fraction is, whether or not that remains attractive in an environment where cost of renewable energies is constantly going down. I think the only way you're going to be able to eliminate fossil fuels is if you replace it with something significantly cheaper. And other than that, you really do not see a world regulation coming to pass that would force people away from an available energy source.
So might you characterize then the discussion, or at least the potential positives of this conference, to be that meaningful dialogue with fossil fuels in determining its role for the future, and determining how it should be utilized in transforming economies into something that is a more positive direction? Can we essentially say that this COP28 success should be judged on those merits?
Those are the outcomes I always look for. I don't really put much into what people are talking about. I like to see what the numbers say and what people actually start doing, where they're putting their dollars. So we have to see if they're going to put significant amounts of money into, as we've always discussed, the research and development that's necessary to develop, say, the technologies for sequestration, or the technologies for other forms of energy to compete with the fossil fuels. So these conversations are nice, but often it's just window dressing for a completely separate agenda, or an intentional process of just delaying any sort of action that might be detrimental to a particular industry. And I see that, in water quality work as well, which is, what I've done most of my years. It's exactly the same thing when you're dealing with big polluters, whether it be industrial, urban, or agricultural. Those interest groups will fight a delaying action as long as they possibly.
Can we trust former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry to successfully challenge that those perspectives, the perspective that these oil barons, their job, as far as they see it, is to extend the lifespan of their companies. Do you have any faith that folks like John Kerry can lead the U.S. or at least can take the U.S.'s position from, the Trump era of deregulation and, increasing carbonization to decarbonization and to more green avenues, especially given the fact that he has been the climate czar of the U.S. since since the election.
Well, that's sort of predicated on the assumption that if we achieve certain goals in the United States as far as weaning ourselves off of fossil fuel, decarbonizing our economy, that would deliver the desired outcomes globally. We're a small percentage of population, a significant population of current energy consumption, but anything we do in the United States for it to have a real impact on the ultimate outcome of this climate crisis has to be adopted by the rest of the world, because that's where not only the larger numbers of people are, but the numbers of people who are seeking to increase their consumption to levels of resources and energy consumption that we enjoy in the Western world, in the United States, Europe, and several other countries. So unless whatever we do in the USA also affects a parallel change in those societies, it's really of no consequence. So regulatory constraints on industries in the USA, that might make us feel better, but I do not think that the other nations will necessarily follow that lead. The only lead that they're going to follow is technology that's cheap and delivers what they want from energy in an effective way that can compete with the other ways of getting that energy. So I just keep coming back to the same thing because the numbers don't lie. We have 8 billion people on the planet now, and they say we'll probably level off at, say, 10 billion. And, that's an increase of what, 25%, right? However, there's currently, out of the 8 billion we've got, there's probably 6 billion who have very low consumption rate. And they want to increase that not by 25%, they want to increase it by 3 or 4-fold. So 300%, 400%. Even if we come down and they go up to say 300% above their current consumption rates, that's still 6 billion people climbing that energy curve. And that's the real impact upon the climate, not what we do at this point. So what we have to do is develop the methodologies that other nations are likely to adopt. And I don't see regulatory as being the model the rest of the world will pursue. I just don't see that happening.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that concept, which kind of leads into a discussion that we have rather frequently between you and I on the use of nuclear and the use of other green energies to perhaps, instead of regulate, offset the curve as it continues to slightly increase before it will eventually level off and then decrease in our use of carbon. I think that nuclear, ever since I've been attending these conferences, has arisen in terms of perception and importance as people begin to realize that other green technologies such as wind and solar, while wonderful, simply do not showcase the amount of energy needed to beat this curve or to decarbonize as efficiently as wind and solar can over the long period of time. So whereas solar and wind and hydro and other greener forms of energy, so to speak, greener quotations there, they simply won't be able to ramp up at the rate that we would be able to with regard to nuclear investment today. So what kind of dollar investment today yields a decrease in carbon tomorrow at the greatest possible rate? What are you seeing on the ground with regard to those specific technologies, other than, what we're seeing in the headline news?
Well, tomorrow I'll present, like I did last year, sort of a breakdown of the categories of the 180, maybe 200 pavilions that I see listed in the directory. And there's, I think, about 4 nuclear exhibits, but I can't say for sure. There may be more than 4. But nuclear, it's you've got the safety issue and the cost issue. It's uncertain if nuclear can bring its costs down sufficiently to compete with the other energy sources. Solar and wind and perhaps some other renewables are positioned to perhaps replace our current energy consumption. But sort of as you're alluding to, and as my other comments about 6 billion people who are looking to increase their consumption, that's a lot more than just replacing what we're currently consuming. And then you have the need to begin taking carbon out of the atmosphere. We're not going to decarbonize in time without having these carbon negative technologies put in place. So we're going to need vastly more energy than simply replacing our current stocks. Nuclear is one option, and again, we'll have to see if technologies can deliver the public sense of safety. They would argue that their safety record is sufficient and actually better than many of the other energy industries, but it comes with a higher risk factor. So again, I think research and development is key there. We don't necessarily want to ramp up industries or specific technologies that are a little premature at this point.
Absolutely.
We need to prototypes. We definitely need to build prototypes so that you can gain the experience to move on to the next level of technology. But you don't necessarily want to build 1,000 of them.
Absolutely. And this is something which, as a student, I find incredibly important, both as a university which can potentially be testing some of those technologies, but also as someone who sees the long-term possible use of those technologies over time, and also the need to train the next generation of operators and inventors and researchers who will consistently and hopefully over the long term perform this or take this research to the next level so that it can be ready for long-term production and implementation in 10 years down the line when it's actually ready to be implemented.
As Democrats, we're going to try to interact with the various representatives that'll be showing up and seeing if we can get a little bit of their time to ask a few key questions. And how we introduce these concepts of research and development and innovation and production, I'm not sure that's going to be in their stump speech, their climate stump speech. So we're going to try to elicit a little more in-depth consideration and try to get some insights into their deeper perspectives on this, as opposed to more money for electric vehicles and improving the grid and all of these job programs and subsidy programs to maintain our economy through this transition. So I'm hoping we'll be able to explore that particular question as we meet some of these representatives.
Absolutely. Have you actually seen any high-profile people on the ground yet?
No, the U.S. Pavilion isn't even open yet.
Oh my. Okay.
So
When
maybe we wrap it up for today. Little introduction to what's going on here at COP, and we'll begin to explore more tomorrow and see what we find and who we find.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in today. As always, if you have questions, be sure you either, if you are attending via Zoom, throw them in the chat. If you're attending via Facebook or YouTube, throw them in the chat there. We have somebody monitoring those. And we plan on seeing you tomorrow at the exact same time, which is going to be 10 a.m. Eastern for our coverage of COP28 in Dubai. Thank you very much for attending. We'll see you tomorrow.